Well, I'm excited for the opportunity to teach tonight. When Pastor first asked me if I would be willing, as many of you find your seats, Pastor first asked me if I'd be willing to share while he was gone, I said on one condition, that I get to do both of the Wednesday nights, because I would like to do something that encompassed a little more than one night. So we're going to start a concept tonight. We're going to talk about kind of what I would consider the first half of it. We're going to culminate it next week. And so I hope that you'll be back for that next week, and I hope that you'll desire even more after hearing what I share tonight to be back for that next week. We're going to be in Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians chapter 5 is where we're going to be at tonight. The topic I want to discuss this evening is this. It's the motivations in the Christian life. Motivations in our Christian life. What motivates us, what motivates you, what motivates me to live for God, to follow the Bible? Ephesians chapter 5, verses 1 and 2 says this, "Be ye therefore followers of God as dear children, and walk in love as Christ also hath loved us, and hath given himself for us an offering and a sacrifice to God for a sweet-smelling savor." I love the comparison that Paul makes here. He says, "Be therefore followers of God as dear children." As I was studying this passage out, that word followers has the idea of being an imitator. It has the idea of trying to be like or imitating someone, right? We've all heard that statement, right? Mimicry is the greatest form of flattery. Oftentimes, if you've got kids, one of the coolest things to see is your hopefully it's a good thing to see, is to see your child mimicking you, imitating you in some way. Hopefully it's something that you do that's good, not something that you do that's bad. Teenagers over here, you're chuckling a little bit to yourself, but you're gonna give it about 5, 6, 7 years, and you're gonna look in the mirror one day and realize with shock and horror that you are your mom or you are your dad. Some of you are realizing that even more. Some of you parents look at them and say, "That's exactly me. Wow." But the reality is that God desires for us to follow him in that same way, to be like Jesus Christ, if you will. But in verse 2, he gives us what should be our motivation for this. In verse 2, he says and walk in love, as Christ also hath loved us. Unfortunately, in our Christian lives, however, we find ourselves with wrong motivations far too often. You see, the motivations that we find ourselves utilizing in order to pursue that walking with God or that following God they're not the right ones. So this evening, I'd like to look at a couple of wrong motivations in our Christian life, and then to cap it off with what should be the right motivation in following God in our Christian life. The first motivation that I see in the Christian life that is incorrect, that is wrong, is this. It's a performance-driven motivation. A performance-driven motivation. Now, what do I mean by this? What I'm talking about here is it's a culture or a feeling of acceptance based on how we perform or behave. Based on how we perform or behave. The idea that this entails is that we create this situation in our lives where my relationship with God, my standing with God is solely based on how well I do. It's my ability to speak correctly, or my ability to do the right things. It's the amount of time that I spend in Christian ministry, or maybe how often I share the gospel or engage in conversation about Jesus Christ. See, performance-based motivation creates an inner circle of performers, especially within a church, those that do the best or do the most. Often you'll hear someone refer to this as maybe the core of the church. Or maybe they'll talk about, well, he's just a really strong Christian because we see what he's doing on the outward. And while our outward actions are not inadvertently in and of themselves wrong, when we utilize them as our motivation, when we utilize our performance as our motivation, we find ourselves in a very dangerous spot. As one pastor I know put it, he said this, it's salvation by grace, but now you've got to perform your way into that inner circle, so to speak. You see, this performance, it leads us to pride. When we're doing well, We become very prideful in our abilities, right? If I'm able to fulfill a ministry maybe better than those around me might be able to, or I'm able to lead more people to Christ, or my testimony is just so much more impeccable than those around me, it leads us into this sense of pride in our ability to perform. But then on the flip side of that, when we're unable to perform, it leads us into insecurity. As we look at ourselves and we realize our inability to accomplish that which is not really ours to accomplish. And so then we create this chasm between two sets of people. We have the people over here that might be, like we said earlier, part of that inner circle, or maybe if you want to use the terminology, core members of a church or something like that, or a super Christian, if you will, who are able to perform and might have the ability, at least right now, to accomplish what we might classify, or they might classify as what makes up the Christian life. And you have those over here who have become exhausted, or maybe they just don't understand why that must be a part of the Christian life, or why I have to be that way. Maybe we just haven't come to that realization or understanding yet, and we are unable to perform, and we become insecure. This performance-driven motivation leads us to discouragement. It discourages us when we realize that I can't perform to the standard of the person next to me. It leads us to exhaustion. How many of you have been there before? Eventually, after serving for so long, you get tired. And your performance diminishes as a result of that. It leads us to disillusionment. This is a scary one. When we are performing well, we begin to think that somehow we have a better standing with Jesus Christ. My friends, that's the definition of legalism. Saying that because of something that I did, I'm suddenly have a better relationship with Christ. When Christ says, no, it's not about what you did, it's about what I did, my sacrifice. And eventually, every single one of us will get to a point in life where we cannot perform. Whether it be just because of sheer exhaustion, of old age, of being put into a position where God says, hey, I don't want your works anymore, so I'm going to take those away from you entirely. Whatever it might be, we find ourselves in a position in life where we cannot perform. And suddenly this works-based environment that we've created is something that we're no longer able to attain to. It is a joy killer and a recipe for ultimately resenting whatever is driving you. If I may, let me give you an analogy in this way. How many of you grew up in a home with more than one child? You are not an only child. You have an older sibling, younger sibling, something like that. Okay, that's exactly where I'm at. I have 3 older sisters and 1 younger brother. If you've met any of my siblings, you will understand that we are a very unique family. We are a very driven group of individuals. Now, oftentimes, what do you see as the situation in many families? You'll see kind of get split up, right? You'll almost have like, this is the child who is the most driven. They're able to perform to the best. Maybe they're academically successful in some way. And how often, what do the other children often look at them and feel? They look at them and say, well, I can't meet up to that standard. I'm not as smart as them. What do unfortunately a lot of parents often do? Well, Johnny gets good grades. Why can't you get good grades? You're my kid just as much as Johnny's my kid. How is he able to excel in school and you're not able to excel in school? And parents often begin to maybe compare one child to the other. And even if the parent doesn't, oftentimes children in their own minds do this. What does that begin to develop in that child's heart? A resentment. They begin to resent their sibling because I just can't perform up to the standard that they set. I'm not able to accomplish academically whatever they accomplish. Or maybe as an adult, I'm not as successful as they are. I didn't graduate with whatever degree. I didn't go as far in whatever career field. I don't have that same standard ability. And we begin to maybe resent our sibling as a result of this. Or maybe we resent our parents for holding us to this standard. Oftentimes we see children resent their parents either way because they perceive that they hold them to the standard even when they don't. And suddenly you begin to see this analogy taking shape. In this analogy, the parents become in the position of God, right? Where the children look up to their parents and they see this standard that their parents are placing on them. But we as Christians, in the same way, when we're performance-driven, we look up to God and we see this standard that God is placing on us. Maybe it's a standard that somehow we got placed into our mind through a misinterpreted passage of Scripture. More than likely, it's a standard that got placed into our mind because someone was not grace-filled in explaining to us what the Christian life entails. We begin to compare ourselves among ourselves, right? We look around us and we say, well, if that Christian lives that way, then maybe I've got to live like them. For no other reason than besides just living like them. We begin to compare ourselves around there. And then there's that perfect child or that perfect Christian that we feel like we can never attain, and after a while we're just going to quit. After a while, we as Christians are going to begin to resent that perfect Christian. We might even begin to resent God because we have placed on him an idea that he compares us to this other Christian when God says, no, that's not at all what I do. The reality is, at some point we have to realize that the perfect standard does exist, and his name is Jesus Christ. But he's not the perfect standard to say we have to be like him in order to find love in God's eyes. He's the perfect standard to say he fulfilled all the law so we didn't have to. He fulfilled the law to go to the cross to pay for our sins, to give us freedom from being performance-driven. But what is the major danger with this motivation, this performance-driven motivation? Well, the first one I see within a church specifically is that when we bring this mindset within the walls of this church building, we've suddenly brought the world into the church, have we not? If you go to a workplace every day, every single day of your life, you are under that performance-driven microscope. If you don't perform, you're out. If you don't perform, you miss the promotion. If you don't perform, you're cutting off your career at the knees, so to speak. And we take what we as Christians have to face day in and day out in the world, that performance-driven mentality where we have to accomplish something in order to find favor, in order to find promotion, and we bring it within the walls of the church. And suddenly the church is no longer fulfilling what it's supposed to fulfill. The church is supposed to be an assembly of believers that provides reprieve from the mindset of the world, from the way the world thinks and acts and does things. But now we've created an environment that does it exactly the same way. We just do it with spiritual terms. And now we're coming in on Sunday mornings and we're saying, well, because he didn't dress as nicely as I dress, he doesn't have the same standard of giving your best to the Lord, or man, they don't serve in ministry. How come they don't serve in ministry? I serve in ministry. Look how good I am. Or maybe, man, I can't believe I just don't feel like I have the ability to serve in ministry like that person does, on the flip side of it, if you will. Or, man, I wish I was able to get up and minister to people like that person does. And we start to look around, we compare ourselves among ourselves, and the Bible flat out says that is not wise. And this performance-driven mentality creeps into our church walls and starts to make our church no different than the world. Inevitably, the weak will fall away. The ones who cannot perform, the ones who are unable to accomplish at least what they see around them, or they're going to fall away. They're going to maybe grow resentful. They're just going to grow weary and tired and not be able to keep up. And we're going to see them disappear. And while that inner circle grows tighter and tighter, we begin to see, well, we're the ones that kept this church going. We're the ones that labored long for this. We're the ones that gave time and time again for a building. We're the ones that served in the children's ministry for all these years. And we start to base our spirituality on our ability to perform. And the reality is that the greatest danger of this is that it is anti-gospel, because the gospel says anybody come, no matter your standing, no matter your ability, no matter your background. The gospel says all are welcome. But this performance-driven mentality says you're welcome if you can perform in some way, if you bring some sort of temporal value. We find great danger here. But what is the truth to contradict this mentality? The truth is this, that salvation is not performance-oriented. It has nothing to do with what I can accomplish or what you can accomplish. And sanctification is an organic work of God's grace and a gift of his heart. You see, sanctification is not about my ability to conform myself or to transform myself. I have no ability to become different in my own strength. When the Bible tells me to be transformed, It's not by my power, it's by the power of God. It's by the working of the Holy Spirit in my life. This performance-driven motivation is a danger to us. It's a danger to our church, and it's contradictory to the gospel. But when we see salvation for what it is, as the finished work of Jesus Christ, who was able to perform everything and give it to us as a gift, that's going to bring us to the right spot. So first we see that performance-driven motivation, but the second thing that we see is a debt-driven motivation. A debt-driven motivation. All right, I'm going to ask you guys a question. Do we owe God anything? Go ahead, you can shout out your answer. Do we owe God anything? Yes or no? Do we owe God? Everybody is terrified except for him. Everybody else is terrified to answer. You guys have picked up that that's a trick question, haven't you? Well, you could answer it this way. It depends on how you define the word owe. I owe God everything in the sense that without him I would be nothing. I would be on my way to hell. I owe him the fact that I'm on my way to heaven, but I do not owe him in the sense of repaying him. But yet this is how we live our Christian lives, is it not? So often this is the motivation that we have. As we look through the New Testament, the only time we see debt being talked about outside of the parables of Jesus Christ is when Paul says that he is a debtor. But he does not say, I am a debtor to God or I'm a debtor to Christ. Instead, he says, I am a debtor to both the Greeks and to the barbarians, both to the wise and to the unwise, Romans 1:14. What is Paul saying there? He's saying, I'm a debtor to these people to share the gospel with them. I have a debt to them. I've been given something, now I want to give it to them. That's the only time we see this concept of debt mentioned in the Bible. What is this? Well, the key words we see in this are both owe and debt. Owe and debt. It's this idea. Look back at all that God has done for you, and now get to work and pay him back for all of that. And we use that as motivation, whether it be for ourselves or for those around us. We turn salvation into an obligation. We're saved from the bondage of sin, but then we're brought into the bondage of salvation. It's like telling somebody that we have to and ought to do these things because we were saved. It's like we got saved and God placed this enormous debt of salvation on top of us that we're going to have to work the rest of our lives to repay. But how can we repay that? For me, as a person in leadership in a church, for me to get up and say, hey, you ought to serve Jesus Christ because of how much he's done for you is a gross misrepresentation of what the gospel truly is. But we do that to ourselves. We say to ourselves, oh, come on, I've got to keep going in this Christian life. I've got to keep doing the right things because of what Jesus Christ did for me. That's not how salvation worked. We have to and we ought to do all these things, these commissions that we were given to serve, to give, to go. All the doing of the Christian life is now driven at its source by a feeling of indebtedness by what Jesus did for me. But you know what? Just like that performance-driven mentality, this also ends in exhaustion when we realize I can never pay that back. It ends in disillusionment. Maybe we do think that we can pay it back somehow, and we think that we're making good payments on that debt that I owe. We're doing good. Or it ends in resentment when we realize I'm going to be paying on this debt forever. It's never going to end. So why even try? It's a debt because it's a debt that can never be paid back. To continue with the analogy of parents and children with this, you know what I think one of the worst motivators for kids is? To say to your kids that you ought to work in this house because of how much I've done for you. Man, we brought you into this world and we can take you out of it if we want to. Really? Come on. I provide a roof over your head. I give you food to eat. I give you clothes. What we're showing in that moment is not how much our children know us. We're showing how little we are like Christ. It's a terrible attempt to try to motivate our children by proving to them how much they owe us. We're going to talk about a much better way to do that, and I think you all kind of know where this is going, but that's a terrible way to motivate people. Another analogy that we could give for this would be like buying something. Let's say, and I know we are big proponents of Dave Ramsey, so this is going to be taboo, but let's say we go out and we buy a new car, and we get that car payment. Right? At the beginning, it's easy to make that car payment because we're enjoying that car, and we're like, yeah, man, I love this thing. We're making that payments on it. But after a little while, what happens? We have some kids. The kids get it dirty. Maybe your wife backs it into a pole or the garage, or maybe you backed it into a pole or garage and didn't want to admit it. It doesn't smell like a new car anymore now, does it? The paint starts to wear away. Maybe the seats aren't in as good condition anymore. But we still have thousands upon thousands upon thousands of dollars in debt on that car. And now we're still making that same $400, $500, $600, $700 monthly payment on this vehicle that is far from new. And instead of that feeling like, man, I love making this payment because it's my new car, now what do we feel like? I hate this car. And I still have to make this stupid payment every month for this car that I hate. We resent it. And when we have a debt-driven motivation in our Christian life, that's the same exact thing that's going to happen to us eventually. We're going to get to a point where we're sitting here and we're looking at this Christian life that we realize it's going to be forever till I pay it off because we can't pay it off. It's a debt greater than we could ever pay back. That's why Jesus had to pay it in the first place. And we're sitting there looking like, man, how am I ever supposed to serve God so much that it pays him back and it shows him the amount of love that he deserves for what he did for me? And it's just not looking like it. And I'm going through some struggles, man. It's hard right now. And that Christian life isn't as fresh and shiny as it once was. And now all of a sudden, it's a lot harder to make the payments. And that debt-driven motivation begins to break down very, very quickly. You see, the danger with this motivation is that there's nothing wrong in and of itself with looking at the cross as part of our motivation. But when we look at it with a sense of obligation, that obligation does not belong there. That's not the desire that Jesus had in his heart and his mind when he went to that cross for you and for me. Salvation should not have that weight, that heavy burden that we give it so often. Jesus himself said, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. And we walk around with, I've just got this big weight of salvation on me that I've got to carry. And, maybe if I join the choir and I sing, or maybe if I go serve in the children's ministry, or maybe I help the ushers take the offering every once in a while, it might get a little lighter. I think one of the most humorous parts, if I could even use that word to describe it, about this motivation is the fact that we somehow think that we could ever pay back salvation. As one pastor said, it says this debt-driven motivation makes salvation to no longer be a gift. Instead, it makes it a payment plan that we've opted into. But what is the truth about how we combat this debt-driven motivation? The truth is this, that we are not paying on a debt that receiving Christ that receiving Christ has created on an account. That debt doesn't exist. When we received Christ, he wiped away all of our debt. He says that he was the payment, the full satisfaction of our debt. That debt that we seemingly try to pay doesn't exist. In fact, Jesus' death declares us debt-free. As we think about this, the reality about this motivation is that if God had said, this is how it's going to work, I'm going to send Jesus to die, you're going to get saved, and then you're going to work the rest of your life for me in order to pay off that salvation. It would still be a great deal, would it not? But I'm thankful that that's not how God set it up. God set it up to be a gift, full and free. Not a single part of it did I have to pay back. This motivation downsizes salvation and instead drives people with a sense of obligation. And the funny thing is that it works. We use this in churches all the time to motivate people. We say, you got to come out and share the gospel because God gave the gospel to you and you owe him everything for that. The least you can do is turn around and give it to somebody else. You don't owe God that. God never required that of us as an obligation. We say, you should spend time serving God in some way. What's a little hour here and there to come down to the church and maybe paint a wall or clean up a classroom? God gave you so much in salvation. And it works. If I were to stand up here today and if I had not taught this lesson, I were to stand up today and use that as a motivator, we'd get at least a decent-sized crowd out on Saturday to come clean up some classrooms or something like that. It's very heavily utilized in our churches today across the world. But eventually, the burden of paying on salvation will outweigh the joy of salvation. It happens every time. We're human. We're not able to carry that burden for long. And it completely contradicts the concept that Jesus gave when he said, I will give you rest. So we see this performance-driven motivation. We see a debt-driven motivation. We understand that both of those are not the right ways to live our Christian life. So then what is? What is the proper motivation to live our Christian life? Well, it's as simple as this. It's a love-driven motivation. It's a love-driven motivation. You see, a heart that is purely driven by a love for Jesus Christ will serve him greater than anything else. 1 John 4:19 says this, we love him because he first loved us. It's a response. It's not something that comes out of nowhere. It's us looking at the love of God and responding in kind. It's this. Love is the only viable, sustainable motivation for the Christian life. You see, performance-driven breaks down because Jesus so fulfilled the law that we can never perform to his standard. Ever. The debt-driven breaks down because Jesus once and for all paid for my sin debt, and I don't owe him anything. But that love-driven motivation says, because I see how good God has been to me, I want to respond in kind. To give an analogy of this, once again, it would be saying it's easy to love someone who loves you, right? If I were to come up to Mike and just on a consistent basis up here, if I were just to be nasty to Mike, I make snide remarks about him all the time. I constantly make fun of things about him. Maybe I just find ways to undermine him or whatever. If I'm constantly just being negative towards him, Mike's going to have a hard time responding in love to me. He's going to sit there and say, I know the Bible says that I should love my enemy, but man, he's making it hard to love him. But if I'm standing here and I'm constantly kind to Mike, I'm bringing him donuts, I'm bringing him coffee, I'm just doing whatever I can to make his life easier. Maybe when he's out to sea, I write him a letter of some sort, or maybe something comes up while he's out to sea and I try to jump in there to help his family out. It's going to be a lot easier for Mike to love me. You see this concept perfectly if you're a parent. My 3-year-old son Joshua was not born with a natural tendency to show love. He doesn't get that concept on his own. You know where he got that? Because I loved him. As I, his father, as his mother, showed love towards him, showed care for him, served him in different ways, as we shared that emotion, that action, if you will, with him, he picked up on that, and now he responds in kind. Joshua can't do anything for me. He can't pay back the debt that he might think he owes me for being his father and providing for him. He can't perform to any standard. He's 3 years old. But instead, as he sees the love that I give to him, he responds back in the same way. Now, does he respond back in perfect love all the time? By no means. This is also where the analogy breaks down, because as his parent, I do not give him perfect love all the time either, like God gives to me as a Christian, as his child. You see, as we compare that concept of love, that have to, ought to gets replaced by get to, want to. And so no longer do I say, I have to serve God because of how much he did for me. No longer do I say, I ought to go out and do this for God because I got to perform to that standard. Now we say, man, I get to do these things. I want to do these things because of how good God is to me. That's exactly the reason Paul was standing there saying, I'm a debtor to the Greeks, to the barbarians. That's exactly why Paul was standing there saying, hey, I want to do whatever I can for the gospel because why? The love of Christ constraineth me. It moves me, it motivates me into every situation. I think another great illustration of this is the idea of exchanging gifts at Christmas. How many of you guys have ever been around somebody who the way that they buy a gift is they wait to see what you got them and they try to find something to buy that is of equal value? Right? We've all been there. Don't raise your hand if you are that. You can raise your hand if your spouse is like, I'm just kidding. Don't raise your hand that way either. That's debt-driven motivation. Right? Debt-driven motivation says, well, if Brother Zellman over here got me a gift that was worth $15, maybe he got me a $15 Starbucks card, then my debt-driven motivation says, well, then I should probably give him like a $15 Jamba Juice gift card. Because I'm now indebted to him that $15 card. Performance-driven motivation says, oh, well, because I'm their child, now I have to. Because my dad is my parent, because of how much he did for me, right? Because I'm a part of his household, this is just the standard that I'm expected to meet, and so I have to get him a present. That's not how it works. Can you imagine if I treated my wife that way? Well, we're married, so I have to take her out and do things for her every once in a while, so come on, honey, get in the car, we're going to Taco Bell. I would not fly. Not even close. But you know what's funny? I could do that exact same thing and say, come on, honey, get in the car. We're going to Ruth's Chris Steakhouse, and here's a bouquet of roses and a brand new whatever the thing you want recently is, and here's a preloaded credit card to go on a shopping spree. I could do all that same way, but if I do it because I had to, it would still fall flat. And we suddenly realize that a love-driven motivation that takes her to Taco Bell is worth way more than a debt-driven or performance-driven motivation that takes her to Ruth Chris and does all the other things. We overvalue our ability to hand God this perfectly packaged and ornate gift that we might be able to give him. We give that so much value, but the reality is that God is just looking for a real expression of love that comes from right here. God is not worried about whether we are the greatest servant in the church or the one that accomplishes the most for his kingdom, because that's not based on me. God is worried about how much of my heart he has. You see, the danger in performance-driven is that it is all exterior, which encourages a corrupt heart driver. It says this, God will excuse this action because I've been performing really well recently. I've been doing really well in my Christian life, man. I haven't missed my devotions. I haven't missed a single time of ministry, man. I haven't called in sick for the nursery in like 2 years. So if I do this action that I know is wrong, I should be good to go because I've performed really well. The danger in debt-driven is that it leaves you to do the bare minimum as a way of payment, to keep God off your back, right? I'm ahead on my payments right now, so if I take a break and I maybe take a little bit of a vacation from this Christian life thing, it should be good to go. I'm ahead on my payments, so. But love drives our hearts deeper into a motive that lives in reverence, awe, and fear of God's holiness and gratitude for his love. It overflows into performance, and it overflows into performance behaviors that are driven from the right source. Let me be clear about this. When I talk about that performance-driven motivation, what I'm saying is wrong there is the motivation behind it. To want to do things for God, to want to perform, so to speak, for God is not wrong in and of itself. It depends on where our motivation is coming. For me to say, God, you are so great. I can't even comprehend how you would love me so much to send your son to die for me. I can't do anything to repay that, but I want to do everything I can because I love you. That's a real motivation. Now, often we become cynical as we see this in the lives of others. We hear other people say, well, that's not the right motivation. You know, we should be motivated from a heart of love. And we become cynical and we say, well, then we'll never get things accomplished that way. That's because we don't believe in that right motivation that God lays out for us. So what is the truth about this love motivation? The truth is this, that first of all, God wants your heart before he wants anything else. Paul makes that clear as he talked about one church that gave, he commends them not because of how much money they gave. He commends them because they gave of themselves first. They gave their heart first. I like how one preacher put it, when you give God your heart, your checkbook's sure to follow. Well, we could add on top of that, when you give your God your heart, your feet are sure to follow. Your mouth is sure to follow. When we give our God our heart, in true love, everything that is along with us goes with. Like I said earlier, that God will take the feeblest expressions of sincere love because they mean more to him than the grandest performance-driven works. One more thought, then we finish. I'll be finished for the evening. Do you know why we open our services with worship, with songs, with music? Because the goal, the desire that we have is that we would spend some time first thinking about who God is and what he's done for us. Because we understand that if we desire for God to work in your heart through this book, the fastest way to see that happen is to get you to see how God has worked for you. I understand that before pastor can get up here and declare the word of God and try to challenge us to maybe give up sin in our lives or challenge us to be bolder in sharing the gospel or challenge us in some area of the Christian life, that if we'll first start and take an opportunity to step back and say, God, how is it that you would send Jesus Christ to the cross? How is it that you would allow your son to be dead in a grave for 3 days? But God, I'm so thankful that he rose again. That's why this past Sunday we sang about the finished work of Jesus Christ on the cross. That's why we took time to sing songs that reminded us that he was victorious over that grave, that death did not have a hold on him, that he did not stay in that grave, but he rose triumphantly, conquering sin, conquering death, conquering hell, because we want to take a moment to stop and think about who God is. Because when I consider who God is, just like my son naturally responds in love towards my love, when I consider the love of God for me, the natural response in my heart should be to love him back. My friend, that's why it so discourages me when I see people walk in late for worship time, when I see them miss it, because it's so vital. That's why it pains my heart when I see people stand there and not participate in it and look bored and basically saying with their body language, can we just get through this because I only came to hear the preaching. It's so important for us as a church family to take that time to remind ourselves about who God is and how much he loves us. That's why it's so often you'll hear pastor or myself encourage you to take a time in your personal devotions to maybe sing or to read through some of the songs that we sing about who God is, to remind yourself about his goodness. I challenged the singles a couple weeks ago when we were going through a study in 1 John. I said, you want to see your love for God increase? Every day this week, go through one of the gospel accounts of Jesus' death, his burial, or his resurrection, or all of them. And just remind yourself of the agony that Jesus Christ went through, not to show you that you owe him anything, but to show you how much he loves you. Because performance isn't going to get us there. Debt is not going to bring us to where we desire to be. Because a person who truly worships Jesus will truly serve Jesus. When we come with a heart of love, just like Paul describes in Ephesians chapter 5, and walk in love as Christ also hath loved us and hath given himself for us. When that is our heart's motivation, we're going to keep going and keep going and keep going. We're going to serve Jesus for as long as our hearts are truly in love with him.